Ms Goodwitch's combat classes tend to come at the end of any given day. The better for them to work up an appetite and not have to attend lessons exhausted or covered in sweat. The latter was a boon for him, the former didn't change. 2, maybe 3 hours of sleep, and even then, it was only after he dragged himself from the ocean, half drowned and shaking like a leaf. The waves and dark waters had prevented Crow from following him. Hell, they'd almost prevented him from reaching shore alive. He was glad he had, of course. Drowning wasn't all that bad a way to die. It was strangely peaceful and floating, but so soon into Beacon would have been a pain. From there, it had been a sodden slog back to Beacon, sneaking through the Emerald Forest to avoid detection, fighting a through Grim en route, only to arrive back at 5 in the morning. Honestly, he was lucky Zui was the only one to notice him as he collapsed into bed. But it was done. He managed to shut down that damn place. Through all the exhaustion, all the pain, the difficulties he had keeping his eyes open during the day, that simple victory kept him going. Blake hadn't even noticed and didn't seem to now. She was engaged in conversation with Yang and Sun, though clearly trying not to humor the latter. Sun, for all his 4 boils, took it like a champion, shrugging off her rather rude behavior and flashing Jaune a grin at the same time. He's persistent, I'll give him that. Getting into Blake's good graces was going to take a little more than that, however. Hopefully Ms Goodwitch doesn't ask for you to fight. Weiss mumbled to him. Jaune threw back a little smile, raising an eyebrow towards his partner. If you're about to make a crack about my concern, save it. You're exhausted and liable to collapse at any moment. She gave him a look up and down. Are you sure you're not ill? He wasn't. In all honesty, the water had been frozen and the chill temperature at night hadn't made his trip home any better. Avoiding Ozpin's security cameras was also a chore, though thankfully one he was a little more used to. You tended to learn where the main ones were after going through them so many times. I don't think I'll be caught up, he said. Let's hope not. Weiss sighed. You're distracted when you're tired. What happens if you miss something or make a mistake? Then I get knocked around the ring for a bit. He shrugged. Don't worry, I'm fine. I just didn't get much sleep. It was a busy night. She scowled at him for that, turning her nose up and ignoring him as she walked away to talk with Ruby and Pyrrha. Oops. He'd forgotten what she thought he'd been doing for a moment, or rather, who she thought he'd been doing. Welcome to the new term, Ms Goodwitch called, silencing the students with her voice alone. You have no doubt noticed that our numbers have grown on last year. I hope you'll take the time to welcome our transfers from other schools with open arms. Oh, he noticed alright. His eyes narrowed as he glanced towards one end of the hall, where he could see Cinder, Mercury, and Emerald standing just away from the main procession of Haven students. Just the sight of them made his blood boil and teeth grind together. He had to remain calm, however. Doing anything else would just draw attention on himself and his team. He wasn't strong enough to stop them, and even if he killed them right away, it wouldn't change anything. Mr. Ark, the woman's voice cut into his thoughts, though he wasn't sure what he'd done to draw her attention. Oh wait, why was everyone else sat down? Weiss was scowling and motioning for him to sit. While I applaud your choice of a new outfit, Mr. Ark, there is no reason to show it off to everyone such. Oh, you noticed. Have you been checking me out? We could skip combat class and meet in your office in, let's say, 10 minutes? Thank you for volunteering for this fight. Ms Goodwitch didn't miss a beat. Now, if we can have a volunteer to spar with Mr. Ark, that would be appreciated. He had to admit, there was a certain sense of pride that shot through him as he saw every single Beacon student lean back nervously. Team Carden even whimpered. No one? Ms Goodwitch seemed less amused, hands on her hips as she shook her head, thoroughly disappointed with the mantle of her students. Then I suppose one of the new students must suffice. Ah, Mr. Wukong. Sun looked around as to see if there was any other Wukongs in the crowd. When her teacher's frown turned a little sharper, however, he practically flew up onto the stage. Hey man, Sun waved a hand awkwardly. Jaune took one look at him before turning to the blonde woman. Can I have a different opponent? This one keeps flirting with me. Hey, I wasn't flirting. Denied. The woman's crop slammed into the palm of her hand. The bout will continue until your aura hits the red, or I call it finished. Am I understood? Sun nodded while Jaune rolled his eyes. She repeated it for every single fight, but then again, he supposed there were a few people who kept trying to push it. Also, Mr. Ark, all previous rules specific to you remain in force. Am I understood? Okay, now that was just unfair. Understood. He sighed. Specific rules? Sun suddenly looked nervous. Maybe he was remembering what happened at the docks. Or at least what he must have been told when he woke up. He isn't going to crash a bullhead into me, is he? Repeat the rules for us, Mr. Ark. A few people in the crowd started to mutter and giggle. Mostly the new students who hadn't seen what he'd done for the past few fights. Jaune sighed. No forfeiting. No calling timeout and then attacking people. No calling my teammates up to fight in my place. No running into the spectators to use them as human cover. The laughter stopped as some of the transfer students started to look a little nervous. And no bringing weaponry into the ring like a taser and using it on his balls. Sun crossed his legs. And Jaune blinked. That was it, wasn't it? Ms Goodwitch frowned. There will be no commandeering military vehicles to use on your opponents. Oh, thank God. That wasn't officially made a rule, Jaune said. I thought better of it, she said and stepped back. Now that you know the rules, begin. Sun drew his weapon immediately, holding it in staff form in front of him but not making any move to attack. If anything, he looked uncertain whether he should or shouldn't. His eyes kept flickering past Jaune, back to where his team sat. Ah, so he wasn't sure what to do in case he upset Blake. You know, Jaune said, if you surrender, I can see about convincing Blake to go on a date with you. Sun's eyes widened, but a different blonde cut in before he could agree. I believe we just covered that you cannot have your teammates fight for you. I'm not asking her to fight. Fine. And then consider that act of pimping out your teammates banned henceforth. Jaune rolled his eyes. Okay. If you don't surrender, I should not have to say this, but obviously refusing to pimp out your teammates is also banned, Mr. Ark. If I can make a suggestion, try combat. Oh, come on. No hard feelings, eh? Sun twirled his weapon, the staff making a quiet hum as he spun it through the air. He didn't attack, however. Perhaps he was waiting for his opponent to draw their weapon. Jaune sighed as he stepped back, arms wide and without a weapon as he turned to face the Faunus. Sun watched him carefully, not at all fooled by the fact he had nothing on hand. Come to think of it, Sun didn't know anything about his reputation of being lazy, weak, or stupid. All he knew was that Jaune Ark was strong enough to fight off Torchwick and the White Fang. Ms Goodwitch coughed loudly, the threat clear. Sun sighed and dashed forward, feigning up before falling to one knee and sweeping at Jaune's legs. He felt the wind against his legs as he leapt over it, drawing Kurokomo's with a whisper of steel. She flicked out towards his opponent's face. Sun knocked it aside with the tip of his staff, leaping back to put some distance between them. Jaune frowned as he chased after the Faunus. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do in a situation like this. All the other fights had been premeditated, things he'd known about in advance and could figure out a trick to. You know, he said as he ducked under another swing. I wonder what Blake would think if you beat up her old man like this. Sun winced, not following through with the next strike and giving Jaune an opportunity to land a blow instead. The blonde Faunus reeled back, clutching his chest where the pommel of Kurokomo's had struck. Oh, not cool, man. He sighed. Not cool. All's fair in love and war, mate. Sun didn't seem to agree, breaking his staff in two and squeezing off 2 quick shots before rushing in to use them as nunchucks. Jaune's vision blared as he dodged. breath already coming out in sharp pants. His muscles burned despite the lack of activity, and the pain from the previous night racing through him. For a moment, the sword in his hand swayed and he thought he might drop it. He took a deep breath and shook his head, gripping Kurokomor's tighter and snapping back to the real world. The hesitation nearly cost him. The Haven student struck like a meteorite, driving him back with a flurry of aggressive blows. Jaune gasped as one broke past his guard, catching the side of his knee and knocking it aside. He caught himself on one knee, glancing up in time to catch Sun's foot against his cheek. Pain flashed through him as he struck the mat, struggling to drag himself up. Why was he so out of it? A blow like that would have normally done nothing more than wind him. Hey, Sun called, sounding a little more worried. Are you okay, man? Mr. Ark's aura is still in the yellow. Ms Goodwitch answered for him. It would still give him the time needed to pull himself up. His vision swayed a little more. There seeming to be two suns for a second before he shook his head. You can sleep tonight. He growled inside his head. For now, I need you to fight. One thing was for certain. This couldn't go on any longer if he wanted to come out of this in one piece. His muscles were still aching. Not from where Sun had hit him, but general fatigue. The fight, the swim, and then the long wet journey through the forest. He felt so heavy. Miss? His opponent shouted. I don't think he's feeling well. Can we call this off? No. Jaune shook his head and tried to force himself into a more confident position. The last thing he needed was for them to decide he was sick and in need of stay in the infirmary. Normally that would be fine, but Blake was going to go off running without him if he wasn't ready for the little jaunt. That would undoubtedly lead to her doing something stupid and drawing Roman, Cinder, and God knows what else down on them. I'm fine, he snapped. Sun looked unconvinced, crouched down a small distance away with his staff propped up beside him. You sure, man? You look really out of it. We can have a spar some other time if you want to go all overprotective dad on me. He was being protective and it was for Blake, but not in the way Sun seemed to think. His vision cleared as he took a deep breath, drawing Kurokomor's back across his body and dashing forward. Sun flipped back, showing agile grace that had to be partly because of his Faunus heritage. He landed on 2 feet, turning sideways and flicking his weapon out and into Jaune's stomach. Pain flared in his ribs, air bursting from his lungs. He narrowed his eyes and fought past it to land a strike on the Faunus' shoulders. To Sun's credit, he took it well, wincing but ducking his shoulder so that the blade slipped off and couldn't hit his neck. In such close quarters, their weapons were a liability and Sun seemed to realize that. Jaune winced as a knee struck him in the sternum. The next blocked as he brought his own leg up to catch it. He grasped Kurokomor's by the blade, using it two-handed as more of a short sword as he tried to push Sun back. He could see the Faunus' eyes narrowed and focused yet free of anger. Not bad. Sun gasped, managing to twist to the side so that the sword slammed down onto the matting. Don't push yourself if you're sick though. No point fighting just to show off. Isn't that what you're doing? Sun's cheeks flared as he let out a guilty little laugh. Maybe. He admitted, though that doesn't make it bad advice. It just means I'm too dumb to follow it. No. You're just a teenager. Just a normal guy wanting to oppress a girl he had feelings for. Yet despite that, he still had enough empathy to see a guy clearly struggling and stop to help. He was a good man. Sadly. Good men don't always win, and right now he had to make sure this didn't end with a trip to the infirmary. If Weiss or Yang thought he was even the slightest bit in need of a recovery, then he'd never be able to keep an eye on Blake. His eyes flicked towards his scroll, his aura still firmly in the yellow, Sun's quite a bit higher and still green. He was too tired to drag out the fight for much longer, which meant he needed an immediate win if possible. Ring out, surrender, or something that Ms Goodwitch would accept as a clear victory. Well, one of those was easier than the others. Sun's eyes narrowed, the fondness hopping back and clamping his weapon back into a single staff. He fell into a guard stance as Jaune charged in. He slammed into the fondness with as much force as he could muster, pushing his tired muscles as he forced Kurokomore's down in an overhead slash. Sun caught it on his staff, hands either side of the blade as he twisted his body to the side, letting the sword slam down beside him. "Got you!" he yelled, spinning and cutting in towards Jaune's leg. It hit like a truck, a surprising amount of agony spearing through the limb. But he grit his teeth, and he ignored it, grinning as he allowed himself to fall to one knee. Sun raised a foot to kick him in the face, which was when Jaune dove forward, sliding between the teen's legs and grabbing his prize. Sun Wukong went dangerously still. "So?" Jaune asked conversationally, resting flat on his back with sword discarded beside him. "How sensitive is this thing anyway?" His hands were clamped together above his head, a tuft of blonde muscle and fur trapped between it. Sun gasped, pulling his staff up and making to slam it down. "I'm going to pretend that was a gasp of pain and not an orgasm. I've already asked you to stop trying to seduce me, son." "Well, what? Of course it was pain." Jaune gave the tail an experimental tug. Hey. Sun yelped. His arms spasmed and his fingers twitched, the weapon falling from his hands and slamming into his own head. He made no move to catch it as it clattered to the ground. If anything, he seemed paralyzed. Let go." "I'm not feeling very motivated to let go. I might be tempted if you surrender." That isn't exactly fair." Sun growled, wincing as he tried to move away only to stop when his tail tugged. "I can't surrender. I'm the one actually banned from giving up." Sun's eyes flashed towards Blake, or rather, Jaune knew that was where she was. Seriously? Even now, the guy was more worried about making a bad impression. "This wasn't the epic fight I was looking for. Can't you beat me in a way that doesn't make me look like an idiot? You clearly don't know me very well." He gave another tug, making Sun flinch. "Look, you either forfeit or I stand up, still holding your tail, pick up your staff, and beat you with it." He couldn't believe that Sun actually took a second to think about it. "I forfeit," he called out a few seconds later, his head dropped and sulking as the teacher called the match over. Jaune sighed and staggered to his feet, reaching out a hand to clap the guy on the shoulder. "You did well," he said. Sun had fought skillfully. He just hadn't been prepared for such a dirty move. "Don't beat yourself up over it. It's just a spar." "Indeed, Mr. Wukong." Ms Goodwitch strode up to them. "You have learned a valuable lesson from this." "I need to cover my tail." He nodded. The woman blinked. "That too," she said. "But I was thinking more along the lines of not showing mercy to an opponent who appears winded or wounded. They could very well be faking it in order to gain an advantage." Somehow Jaune felt that advice was more aimed towards him than any other injured person. The look on her face suggested she wanted to say, "Don't show him any mercy." On another note, please consider grabbing your fondest opponent's banned. In fact, before I end up regretting this, groping non-fondest opponents is also banned. "Oh, are you saving me for yourself, Galinda?" Last term, she might have erupted. Maybe it was a sign of how she was getting used to him, but she just rolled her eyes and turned away, ignoring him completely. He shrugged either way, smiling slightly when Sun laughed, his bad mood already forgotten. The faunus hopped off the stage, exchanging some quick jokes with his partner who patted his back for comfort. At least they weren't going to take it personally. Sun was a good guy like that. Jaune made to head to his own team, only to gasp as pain shot up his leg. He almost staggered, catching himself at the last second as he swayed to the side. Ms Goodwitch turned towards him. "Are you okay, Mr. Ark?" "I'm fine." He laughed, straightening up and walking purposely away. His eyes glanced up to the aura gauges as he walked away, still firmly in the yellow, still in the safe zone. Blake still couldn't believe he had agreed to come with her. The comparison to the last time she'd done this were obvious. Each time she'd been closely followed by an irritating blonde, and yet this time she had been the one to invite him. "Don't you think it would have been better to come in different clothes?" she asked, glancing towards his white coat and then indicating her own, different outfit. "I would say if I had any," Jaune said as he crouched low behind her. "Besides, with your outfit in mind, we almost look like a pair. It's like a father-daughter bonding session. How cute is that?" She rolled her eyes with a groan, turning away so he couldn't get a reaction out of her. She couldn't complain, of course. She'd asked him to come, and despite horror expectations, he kept his word. He wasn't even causing trouble either, other than a little light ribbing. He kept low to the ground, followed her lead and otherwise kept mostly silent. He seemed to know what he was doing. That raised more questions than it answered, but she promised before that his past could be his own. He was willing to help her, and that was all that mattered. "The building is close by," she whispered. "It's surrounded by perimeter walls so that we need to find a way to sneak over that. We'll cut around it first and get a lay of the land." "Sounds good to me." "Really?" No reluctance. No suggestion they take it easy or not try and sneak their way in. Technically, he'd only promised to help her have a look and see what was going on. She expected a real fight when she tried to actually infiltrate their base. No use looking a gift horse in the mouth. I'll take what I can get. The road to their left and right was empty, Blake dashing across and motioning for him to do the same. His gait was a little clumsier, staggering slightly. "What's wrong?" she hissed as she crouched down beside him. "Just a little sore from the fight with your boyfriend. Don't worry about it." "He's not my..." Forget it. As far as the dorm room banter went, she had a new mother, father, and sister, so it wasn't surprising if they'd go further and imagine an entire family. She'd probably have 6 children by next year. "Will you be okay if we have to fight?" He turned his head to the side, staring at her from the corner of one eye. "Not that we should have to," she hurried to add, wondering why his expression made her feel guilty. "I just mean if something goes wrong. Will you be able to fight?" "I'll be more than capable," he said. "Somehow I don't think that'll be a problem though." Hopefully it wouldn't, but you never knew. Blake shrugged and moved on, ears perked as she heard him quietly make his way behind her. The area would get emptier as they approached, at which point any and all people would likely be White Fang, whether they were in uniform or not. Or rather, that was what should have happened. She knew something was wrong when she saw the flashing lights. An empty pit opened in her stomach. Careful approach turned into a quick jog as she dashed along the wall. "Wait!" Jaune hissed. She didn't, and as she burst free from an alley between 2 warehouses, her eyes widened. "Get back!" Something grabbed her shoulder and pulled her back into the shadows. "Do you want to be seen?" Blake fought to free herself, her flailing wildly as she broke free from his grasp and crawled to the edge once more, peeking out. Red and blue lights flashed far ahead. Though the sirens were turned off, she could see at least 20, along with various parked vans around the building. People milled around while others entered and exited, but there was no mistaking the uniforms for her former colleagues. "Looks like this place has already been raided," Jaune whispered. He didn't sound nearly as shocked as she felt. "How?" she hissed. "When?" The safe house had stood for years. She had known about it for at least 4, but it probably existed long before then. How had the police suddenly found it? Recently by the looks of it, Jaune said as he poked his head out above her. "I can't imagine they would still be investigating if this was a week ago." His words were true. She knew that. She still had trouble processing them. Never before had the authorities had any success in hunting the White Fang. Adam had gotten very good at hiding their tracks, and made sure that every one of his subordinates knew the same. And yet now, within a matter of a single week, they had raided not 1, but 2 different encampments. She made to stand, stepping out from cover. Jaune caught her by the wrist and dragged her back. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "What do you think is going to happen if they see a faunus approaching?" "We're hunters," she whispered back, still a little dazed. "We'll still probably end up spending the night in the station until they figure that out. Even then, what would it achieve? It's not like they'll let us root around the place first, is it?" Blake's eyes scrunched shut, one hand coming up to rub her face. "Right," she said. "Sorry, I'm not thinking straight." She felt his hand let go of hers. There was no point going out there. He was definitely right about that. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Do you know of any other places?" "Not well enough to just approach them." She sighed. "I can find some more if I have a day or 2. Going back to Beacon empty-handed? It wasn't a good feeling. She glanced up as she felt his hand settle on her shoulder. "Maybe we should stop for a drink first," he suggested. "You're looking a little out of it." She wasn't sure what she expected when he offered a drink, but a cozy and a quiet cafe still open late at night hadn't been the first thing to come to mind. He pushed her down into a seat, walking around to the other side and collapsing in himself. A waitress came along to take their order. He's getting some tea for the both of them. He even knew how much milk and sugar she liked. "You feeling a little better now?" he asked once she'd taken a sip. The heat from the mug surfaced onto her hands, the warmth helping to loosen her muscles and release the tension that had built up inside her. She let go a little sigh, leaning back. "Better." She nodded, just a little surprised. "I could tell. You nearly ran straight up to them." "I wasn't thinking straight. Thank you for stopping me." He waved it off, leaning back himself. "Is it really so bad?" he asked. "That the police got there first? I thought that was what you wanted." "It is." "Then why are you so bothered by it?" How did she explain? "I'm pleased the authorities are starting to take notice. It's just that I'm worried by what that means." She glanced up to look into his eyes, but he didn't seem concerned. He didn't understand. "Think about it. Why now, of all times? What has made them act when they were so willing to ignore it before? You think something is going to happen? Maybe they found something out." She nodded. "Maybe when they closed down the first place, they discovered something huge. Something they couldn't ignore." Her fingers drummed on the mug, eyes narrowing. But what could it be? It could be nothing. Jaune met her gaze as she looked to him. "Hear me out," he urged. "The White Fang have been increasing their activity in the last few weeks. We also know from the dogs that they have partnered with Torchwick in order to steal dust. Right?" She nodded. "Well, we could assume that means the hunters and police have found something out." Jaune held one hand out. "Or we could take a more practical approach and just ask if the increased activity has just drawn more attention to the Fang. Think about it. If they've been doing more raids and robberies, then it makes sense the police have been forced to act. But surely they would have done something before if they knew. The White Fang are a terrorist organization and on the wanted list of both Atlas and Vale. To go from not caring enough to do anything to 2 raids in a week? That suggested a certain degree of haste on the part of the local hunters." Jaune leaned forward. "You're assuming again that they chose not to before. If we go with my example again, the White Fang have been acting out more and more, doing more crimes, stealing more dust, taking more risk. Sooner or later, they were bound to make a mistake." Her eyes widened. Could it be? Adam was always cautious, yet the amount of dust they were stealing was far beyond anything they had done before. It wasn't inconceivable that someone down the line might have made a mistake, gotten captured, been interrogated, and the first raid resulted in more prisoners. She realized as she looked towards the leader. He nodded in return. And those prisoners gave up some evidence on the second safe house. He finished. If we're lucky, then they might have found some evidence here as well. This could become a chain reaction which ends up with the White Fang being expelled from Vale entirely. The mere thought of it was enough to have her heart beating wildly. Could she finally be free of them? Would this be the end of whatever they had planned? It won't be enough. A wide pit opened in her chest as she spoke. Adam has ways of doing things. He likes to keep everyone safe and making sure one soul only has a limited information on any other. Only those in really high positions know anything, and they're not going to break if captured. Even now, they would likely be abandoning any nearby locations, shipping dust to new buildings or spreading them out further. The White Fang was a well-oiled machine at times. Like an ant colony reacting to a flood, they would steal anything away to a new home. You knew about this one, Jaune said. Blake laughed bitterly. She should have known, he would realize. I was quite high up in the organization. Adam trusted me. He shouldn't have. Do you feel guilty about this? Her eyes widened. No. Yes, maybe. She sighed. It's stupid of me. You're 17. You're allowed to be stupid. Wasn't it funny how old he sounded when he said that? If it were anyone else, she might have pointed out how they were the same age. But sometimes, he really did feel older. I don't regret leaving the White Fang, she whispered as she stared down into her own tea. They changed from what they used to be, and I don't just mean from peaceful to militant. When they had first started, things weren't so bad. They had decided to fight, but it was only the biased media which told tales of protest to murder. They started with theft first, robberies on people who abused Faunus, always with no casualties or injuries caused. They would partake in criminal damages too, smashing up SDC stations and stealing whatever they could, just to send a message. Adam and she would only fight when pressed, always in self-defense and usually against robotic foes. It wasn't harmless, but it was somewhat ethical. The only blood shed was their own. It didn't work. She whispered. Peace didn't work, so we included some violence, but when that failed, I suppose we just thought a little more would do it. None of us were evil, or at least I don't think we were. You just fell, he said sympathetically, on a slippery slope. Yeah. Her eyes drifted shut as she sighed. Something like that. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting change, Blake, nor is there any evil in being willing to fight for it. Everyone always says we should be willing to fight what we believe in. Yet hypocrisy kicks in and we see someone fighting for something we don't believe in. Suddenly, they're not brave or courageous. They're monsters that need killing. She couldn't help but stare at him, to listen. We preach tolerance, yet it seems like there's not much of it when someone comes to us with a different idea. Make no mistake. He looked up, eyes serious. I hate the White Fang, but I don't hate the people in it. I don't hate you. That was the message inside. Even if in some way she already knew it, he was their team leader, her teammate. Adam wasn't always cruel like that. She whispered. He used to be a young man standing up for a frightened girl, taking a thrown rock to protect her. I don't regret leaving him, but I still feel bad that he trusted me and I let him down. It doesn't make sense. Emotions rarely do. Jaune shrugged. For what it's worth, I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling that way. He was an important part of your life, and from what I'm getting, a good friend too. Sometimes I wonder if I stayed. Could I have convinced him to come with me? Could I have changed his mind and made him change too? I think you already know the answer to that one. Blake's eyes drifted shut as she smiled down into her drink. He was right. She did. Adam would never change, no matter how much she might have wished it. He was determined and stubborn, but more than that, he fully believed in their methods. There was no doubt within him. "You're right," she said, and to her horror her voice almost broke for a moment. "It's just wishful thinking on my part." She sighed. "Thank you for coming out with me tonight. Thanks for trying to help. I'd like to imagine this means you're done." Jaune sighed. "But I've got a feeling that I know you better than that." Maybe he did, she thought, as she fought back a laugh. "You're probably right about the hunters and police," she said, "but that doesn't mean the White Fang are done for yet. I want to see a little clearer. I need to know what it is they're doing. I won't ask you to come with me, but I'm coming with you." Blake's eyes widened as she looked up, face filled with hope. "Really?" she asked. "You don't have to, Jaune. You've done so much already, and you need to stop trying to do things on your own. And God knows what you'll get up to if you don't have someone clear-headed to watch your back. The same rules apply, however. I want to know where it is we're going, and what for." Of course! She nodded happily. "I'll tell you as soon as I have something to go off. I really do appreciate this." She knew it was a pain for him. She knew he didn't want to do it, and maybe, in a selfish way, she was taking advantage of that. She wasn't sure. This wasn't about her own vengeance, however. This wasn't about satisfying her curiosity. The White Fang were planning something. She could see all the hallmarks of it. And if that ended up threatening her team, her new life, it couldn't. It just couldn't. "Far be it for me to leave my apparent daughter in trouble." Jaune drawled. "Why don't you do your old man a favor and get the bill?" "Sure thing, Dad," she fired back, grinning despite her sarcasm. "Are your old bones still hurt from your spa? Or are you just too broke to pay for 2 cups of tea?" He faked a growl and made a dramatic gesture as she chuckled and paid for their drinks. The tension had already seeped away, the fear and the panic from their discovery of the police gone. It was a good thing that they were taking the White Fang seriously, no matter how much her instincts told her otherwise. Perhaps it was just an age-old loyalty acting up. She had a team now, a school and friends. But more than that, she had a family of sorts. Ready. She nodded as she came back, waiting for him to stand. He made a show of finishing his drink, pausing for effect as she rolled her eyes. Eventually, however, he put it down and placed a hand on the table to lift himself up. Her eyes widened when his leg bent beneath him, hands slipping as he fell to the side. She caught him quickly, supporting his weight as he cursed. "What's wrong?" she hissed. He was glancing down at his leg and she looked too, noticing instantly how the foot hovered off the floor. He was afraid to put weight on it. "Are you injured? You moron, why didn't you say anything?" It's fine," he winced. "Just a reminder of the fight with Sun. The spa from earlier? But the aura had been fine. It was just a spa. What could have gone wrong there? He was limping earlier, but that doesn't make sense. He shouldn't have taken any lasting damage from Sun, even if he hit as hard as he could. Jaune's aura hadn't entered the red at all. Do you need me to take you to the infirmary? No, he answered quickly. Too quickly. Blake, it's fine. Your old man is made of stern stuff, okay? His jokes didn't help either, not least of all because it was clearly meant as a distraction. Her eyes narrowed, the hand she wrapped around his shoulder tightening. It'll be gone come the morning. He sighed. If it's not, then I'll go see Miss Kitsune. I promise. She glared at him from the corner of one eye. But will you keep that promise? Jaune laughed. I'll keep it the same way I kept this one. Blake nodded and turned to help him out of the cafe. That was good enough for her.